In 1260, at the heart of the Asian steppes, what remained of Mongol unity shattered in an irreversible move. In practice, the empire was already fractured, not by an external defeat, but by an internal decision. The Kurultai, the traditional Mongol assembly, had divided power among rival heirs, and the result would be a war between brothers. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 left a lingering question among his generals. Was it possible to preserve an empire centered on a single throne, or should the inheritance be divided among his sons in the form of separate khanates? The chosen path, multiple heirs, seemed, at the time, the safer one. It allowed ambitions to be accommodated and avoided immediate civil war. But it planted the seeds of fragmentation. Each khanate operated with increasing autonomy, following its own routes, forging its own alliances, and soon, its own opposing interests. The map made it clear. After Genghis's death, the empire had split into four main blocks: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate of Persia, and the Yuan domain under Kublai Khan. In theory, they all swore loyalty to Genghis's lineage. In practice, orders came from separate, and often contradictory, centers of power. Tension erupted in 1260, when Kublai and his brother Ariq Böke simultaneously claimed the title of Great Khan. Each held his own Kurultai, a symbolic rupture, but one with real consequences. With two command centers issuing orders at the same time, the administrative machinery collapsed. Troops mobilized for the east were redirected west. Taxes collected in one khanate were withheld in another. The war between the two brothers was not merely personal. It was the breakdown of the command chain of a global empire. In this scenario, the Chagatai Khanate became a microcosm of the dispute. Located at the core of the trade routes between China and Persia, it became a logistical pivot. Whoever controlled its roads controlled the flow of tribute and supplies. Within months, clashes between the brothers' armies erupted on the outskirts of caravan checkpoints. In the rear, the Mongol elite faced a moral dilemma. They still fought under Genghis's banner, but no longer knew for which lineage. The sense of tribal unity, the we, that held the empire together, was dissolving. When the common symbol becomes ambiguous, moral cohesion evaporates. Kublai won the struggle in 1264 and consolidated his base in China, giving rise to the Yuan dynasty. But the cost was immense. The empire had survived dozens of campaigns, but could not withstand its own inheritance. From that point on, the name Mongol Empire would become a cartographic fiction, useful for maps, useless in war. In 1260, while Kublai and Ariq Böke were locked in civil war, a very different kind of confrontation unfolded far to the west, one that would redefine the empire's reach. The Mamluk Sultanate, based in Cairo, launched a swift and brutal counteroffensive into Syria and Palestine. The Mongol forces, fragmented and overextended, did not respond with full strength. The Mongol Empire, at its height the most feared war machine in the world, simply did not show up. At the core of this silence was a logistical dilemma. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol domain in Persia, faced enormous geographic hurdles. Stretching forces from the Iranian plateau to the Levant meant traversing deserts, mountain passes, and a thin line of vulnerable supply posts. According to historian David Morgan, the logistical challenges of campaigning westward from Persia were immense and likely underestimated. Every extra week on the road drained provisions and morale. The longer they waited, the more unstable their lines became. But logistics alone didn't silence the empire's response. There was something deeper at play, a loss of centralized confidence. Regional commanders, unsure whether Kublai's authority extended to them or whether the Ilkhanate could operate independently, hesitated. Their hesitation left a power vacuum, one the Mamluks filled without delay. When Sultan Qutuz of Egypt marched north in 1260, he did so against an enemy unsure of its own center. His general, Baybars, struck first near Ain Jalut. There was no unified Mongol army waiting to oppose them. Kublai Khan, leader of the Ilkhanate, had withdrawn east to attend Kublai's conflict, leaving a skeleton garrison under Böke. That detachment was quickly overrun. This was not just a missed engagement, it was a missed turning point. Had the Mongols coordinated a continental response, the Levant might have been absorbed into the empire. But in their internal strife, they left the front door open. The Mamluks didn't just win a battle, they established a psychological precedent. The Mongols could be stopped. Back in Persia, commanders wrestled with a hard truth. Every supply convoy lost to desert raids was a whisper. This empire is no longer everywhere at once. Soldiers questioned why reinforcements never arrived. Merchants, robbed on the trade roads, stopped investing in the war effort. The Levant was not lost in combat. It was forfeited in indecision. What the Mongols failed to fight became a symbol of what they had ceased to be, a singular empire with synchronized fury. From here on, their enemies would fight them piecemeal, and often, they would win. By the late 13th century, the greatest threat to the Mongol Empire was no longer an external army. It was ambiguity. Soldiers no longer knew for whom they truly fought. Across Central Asia, in outposts from Samarkand to Kabul, detachments bore the same banners but answered to different voices. The empire's military structure, once a disciplined machine, had become a puzzle of regional commands. Mongol warbands found themselves standing opposite other Mongol units on battlefields, divided not by nation or language, but by allegiance to competing khans. This fragmentation, subtle at first, turned lethal as trust evaporated. A commander on the western frontier once remarked, "Our enemies no longer wear different armor. They ride like us, speak like us, but serve a different seal." That uncertainty bled into morale. When troops begin to question whether the enemy is a cousin or an imposter, discipline crumbles. This decay was not purely emotional. It had structure, tribal, ethnic, and strategic. As Mongol armies expanded, they absorbed non-Mongol generals, Persians, Turks, Caucasians. Many served loyally. But when decisions came down from Kublai Khan, decisions shaped by priorities in China, resentment festered in the Western ranks. Tribal affiliations, once subordinate to imperial identity, began to resurface. In one striking example, Kublai ordered a campaign towards Central Asia, expecting support from the Chagatai Khanate. Instead, the local commanders stalled. They questioned whether Kublai had legitimate authority beyond his eastern frontier. And when a joint expedition was finally assembled, it dissolved mid-march as contingents peeled off, citing regional emergencies. This was not a coup. It was worse. It was disengagement. Armies began to act as private instruments of regional khans. Campaigns were aborted not because of defeat, but because no one could agree on who was truly in charge. The Mongol war machine, once terrifying for its unity, now suffered paralysis by ambiguity. Back in the camps, soldiers whispered doubts. Was the man beside you following the same orders? Would your flanking unit actually support you in combat? Or turn away when the moment came? When the front line is uncertain, and the rear doesn't answer to your commander, what exactly is an army? In the early 14th century, a once fluid line of command stretching from the forests of Rus to the rice fields of the Yangtze cracked at its center. The diplomatic rupture between the Yuan dynasty in China and the Golden Horde in the West was not loud, but it was decisive, and it cost the empire its final illusion of cohesion. For decades, the Yuan emperors, descended from Kublai Khan, had maintained fragile communications with the Golden Horde. Envoys moved across the steppes, exchanging gifts, affirming kinship, discussing coordination. But after the reign of Monk Timur, those ties began to fray. Embassies were delayed, responses grew cold, and soon, the messengers stopped arriving altogether. The reasons were layered. The Yuan increasingly focused on internal rebellions and Confucian integration, drifting culturally from their nomadic roots. The Golden Horde, meanwhile, leaned into Islamic alliances and regional autonomy. What had been brothers in blood became strangers in priority. This split had tangible consequences. The Silk Road fractured, with caravans now forced to navigate fragmented jurisdictions and rising tolls. Traders rerouted through maritime paths or smaller, localized circuits. The great artery that had once funneled goods and information across Eurasia now pulsed erratically, divided by suspicion. One official in the Yuan court remarked bitterly in 1310, "We no longer know the mood beyond the Altai. We send words into silence." That silence was not empty. It meant broken intelligence chains, missed military coordination, and diplomatic isolation. A Yuan offensive in the east could no longer count on a Western distraction. A horde campaign near Hungary was now an entirely separate war. Even worse, the Golden Horde had begun to court new allies. Muslim powers in Central Asia and the Middle East found common ground with the Horde's leadership. That alignment slowly drew the Horde away from its Mongol lineage, not in name, but in purpose. When the Yuan later attempted to renew communication, it found only indifference. The steppe had moved on. The Mongol Empire had been built on the principle of mobility, of mounted messengers racing across empires to synchronize far-flung armies. Now, the roads themselves were intact, but the will to use them as one had vanished. What happens to an empire when its arteries remain open, but the heart no longer beats in rhythm? The Mongol Empire's strength was never in numbers alone. It was in motion, in the ability to move fast, supply deep, and strike far. But by the 14th century, that motion faltered. Not because of enemy resistance, but because the arteries of war, the supply lines, had splintered. In the arid landscapes of Iran and Central Asia, Mongol armies found themselves strangled by their own geography. Deserts once crossed with ease became death traps. The once disciplined relay stations, yam posts, began to collapse. Without regular supplies of food, fodder, and water, Mongol columns stalled. Local governors, now more loyal to their own khanates than to a central authority, began rationing resources. The flow of logistics became a patchwork of favors and favors withheld. General Tughlaq, stationed near Herat, recorded in 1322, "We rode not toward the enemy, but toward thirst." His expedition was halted, not by Mamluks, not by Persians, but by sand and silence. The real damage, however, wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. With long-range mobility compromised, Imperial planners shifted to defense. But defending an empire the size of Eurasia, without coordinated logistics, is like building a wall across the sky. Regional commanders began prioritizing local fronts. Protect Samarkand, but leave the trade roads to rot. Hold the mountain passes, but abandon the desert stations. Each decision made sense in isolation. But collectively, they unraveled the empire's cohesion. Caravan raids spiked. Merchants pulled back investments. In Khiva, grain prices tripled due to disrupted transport. The economy that once fed the war machine turned inward and brittle. Most damning of all, enemies learned. They no longer needed to face Mongol armies head-on. They just had to choke the roads, torch the wells, and wait. Mongol dominance relied on uninterrupted reach. Once reach failed, so did dominance. By the 1330s, maps still showed a vast empire, but borders on parchment could no longer hide the truth. The empire was dying from the inside out. When supply chains fray, sovereignty becomes a story, not a strategy.